The chief constable blinked at this observation, with the expression of a man who had just been informed that the Emperor possessed no clothes, while Inspector Catchpole shifted his considerable weight from one foot to the other, in a manner suggesting acute discomfort. It was Bunter who retrieved the bonnet in question, holding it aloft with the reverence of an archaeologist presenting a recovered artifact, and Whimsy examined it with the meticulous attention one might afford a particularly complex bit of medieval Latin. The bonnet was indeed damp, not merely moistened, but saturated, as though it had been exposed to quite genuine rainfall of recent vintage, yet the afternoon in question had been characterized by nothing more dramatic than a few scattered clouds, and the sort of pale September sunshine that left the lawns dry as bone. Whimsy turned the bonnet this way and that, observing the peculiar water stains upon the silk, the careful arrangement of the ostrich feathers, now somewhat bedraggled, and the maker's mark inside, which identified the milliner as a Mrs. Penrose of Bond Street, a woman whose creations did not come cheaply. The chief constable ventured the observation that perhaps Mrs. Ashford had recently returned from some outing, a suggestion that Whimsy received with the sort of silence that suggested he was considering whether the question was merely stupid or actively malicious. It transpired, upon examination of the household accounts, that Mrs. Ashford had not left the manor in 3 weeks, a circumstance confirmed by her personal maid, with a certainty born of meticulous habit and the observation that the motor car had not been brought round. This raised the rather pressing question of whose bonnet the article in question might be, a mystery that deepened considerably when the servants, interrogated with varying degrees of gentleness, universally denied any knowledge of its ownership. The gardener had not noticed a second caller. Ann Tibbs, the maid who had heard the raised voices, had encountered no unfamiliar woman in the corridors, and the housekeeper, a formidable widow named Mrs. Craddock, was prepared to swear upon her late husband's memory that every person within the manor was precisely where duty had placed them throughout the afternoon. It was at this juncture that Whimsy expressed a desire to interview Mr. Harrington, and the chief constable, with evident relief at the prospect of delegating responsibility, dispatched Inspector Catchpole to fetch the gentleman from the custody of the local police. While awaiting the suspect's arrival, Whimsy occupied himself with a methodical examination of the morning room, moving about with the air of a man conducting a botanical survey, peering at the curtains, testing the floorboards for their acoustic properties, and pausing at considerable length. Before the writing desk, he observed that the ink used by Mrs. Ashford in her unfinished letter was of a blue-black shade, rather more expensive than the standard varieties, and he remarked upon this to the chief constable with the sort of apparent inconsequentiality that suggested his mind had wandered entirely to matters of superficial interest. He inquired whether the house possessed electric bells or relied upon the older mechanical systems. He asked detailed questions concerning the state of the servants' quarters and the distances involved in their various duties, and he spent a rather remarkable amount of time examining the letter opener itself, noting its weight, its balance, the precise nature of its point, and offering the chief constable a brief discourse upon Italian silverwork of the 18th century, a subject that seemed to perplex that worthy gentleman considerably. By the time Inspector Catchpole returned with Mr. Harrington, a nervous, heavy-set man of middle years whose face bore the distinct flush of one who had spent several hours in considerable anxiety, Whimsy had formed certain preliminary conclusions that he kept entirely to himself, a habit that gave him an expression of serene inscrutability that rather annoyed the local authorities. Harrington was ushered into the drawing-room with the ceremony due a condemned man approaching the scaffold, which perhaps was not entirely unjustified given the evidence arrayed against him. He conducted himself with the defensive bluster of the essentially guilty-minded, protesting his innocence with the sort of vehemence that suggested he was attempting to persuade himself as much as his interrogators. He admitted the quarrel with Mrs. Ashford, a matter concerning the repayment of a sum he had borrowed some 2 years previously, a debt that had precipitated into considerable acrimony when Mrs. Ashford, in financial distress herself, had demanded immediate restitution. Yes, he had been angry, Yes, voices had been raised, but he had left her alive, perfectly alive, seated at her writing desk and attending to her correspondence. He had not touched the letter opener. He had never approached the chaise longue. He had merely conducted his business and departed. Whimsy listened to this narrative with every appearance of profound boredom, occasionally glancing toward the window as though the gardens beyond held greater fascination. And when Harrington had exhausted his protestations, Whimsy posed a single question. Could Harrington recall, with precision, whether Mrs. Ashford had been wearing her bonnet during their interview? The question hung in the air like a particularly unpleasant smell, and Harrington's face underwent a curious transformation. A moment of genuine confusion, succeeded by something that might have been dawning comprehension. No, he said slowly, she had not been wearing a bonnet. She had been in her house dress, her hair unpinned, which raised the question, Whimsy observed to the chief constable with an air of mild academic interest, of who precisely had been wearing the bonnet, and when, and to what purpose. Inspector Catchpole opened his mouth as though to voice some objection, then appeared to think better of it, his expression settling into one of profound bewilderment. The release of Mr. Harrington was effected with rather less ceremony than his detention, and Inspector Catchpole bore the indignity with the stoic resignation of a man whose professional competence had been rather publicly undermined by a civilian consultant. The bonnet, however, now occupied the center of attention in a manner that suggested it had achieved a significance approaching that of the corpse itself, and Whimsy insisted upon a thorough examination of the household to determine its rightful owner. This task proved considerably more vexing than one might have anticipated, for the servants, questioned with increasing precision, continued to maintain their collective ignorance with a unanimity that suggested either genuine bewilderment or a conspiracy of remarkable coordination. Anne Tibbs, the nervous maid, was interviewed again, a process that left her in considerably greater distress than her initial interrogation, and she confessed, under gentle but persistent questioning from Whimsy, that she had heard not merely raised voices but the distinct sound of a door closing, some 10 minutes after Mr. Harrington's departure. She had thought it peculiar at the time, she admitted, her hands twisting together in an agony of remembered anxiety, but she had assumed it was merely the wind, or perhaps the housekeeper attending to some domestic matter. This testimony was immediately corroborated by the testimony of the second housemaid, a sharp-featured creature named Miss Dorothy Finch, who recalled that the morning-room door had indeed been opened and closed during the period in question, though she confessed she had not seen the person responsible for this action. The chief constable received this intelligence with the air of a man watching a carefully constructed theory collapse into rubble, while Whimsy received it with every appearance of satisfaction, as though he had merely confirmed what logic had already established. A careful reconstruction of the household movements revealed that Mrs. Craddock, the formidable housekeeper, had been occupied in the linen room during the relevant period, cataloguing the winter stores with the meticulous attention to detail that characterized all her endeavors. The gardener had been engaged in the south garden, beyond sight and sound of the house proper. The cook was in the kitchen, where the afternoon preparations for dinner had commenced according to the rigid schedule that had governed her days for the past 15 years. And the footman, a young man named William Fletcher, had been occupied in the pantry, polishing the silver with a dedication born of recent instruction in the importance of maintaining household standards. Yet none of these individuals, it transpired, had observed the kitchen door, which provided the most direct access to the morning room from the servants' corridor, being opened during the critical period. This discovery prompted Whimsy to request a detailed examination of the servants' arrangements, and it was in the course of this investigation that a rather curious fact emerged. The household contained precisely 6 servants, yet the room above the kitchen, traditionally occupied by the second housemaid, had been empty for the past month. Miss Tibbs, it seemed, had been sharing quarters with Dorothy Finch in the attic, a circumstance that Mrs. Craddock justified as a temporary economy measure necessitated by the reduced circumstances of the household. Whimsy found this explanation sufficiently interesting to warrant a thorough examination of the empty room in question. The chamber, when accessed via the narrow servants' staircase, proved to be a small, rather austere space, furnished with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a wardrobe of modest proportions. The floor bore the faint marks of recent disturbance, the pattern of dust suggesting that something substantial had been moved within the past weeks, and there remained upon the wardrobe rail a single coat hanger, still swaying slightly, as though recently disturbed. More tellingly, upon closer inspection of the floorboards, Whimsy detected the faint outline of a trunk or similar receptacle that had been removed, and upon the windowsill, overlooked by the servants and the initial police examination, lay a single pale brown hair, fine and distinctly not of the quality one would expect from any member of the established household. Whimsy placed this hair carefully in an envelope provided by Bunter and descended the stairs in silence, his expression suggesting that a particularly obscure quotation had suddenly clarified itself in his mind. Upon returning to the drawing-room, he requested an accounting of precisely how long Mrs. Ashford's household had been in its current financial state, and whether any changes had occurred in the domestic arrangements within the past 6 months. The chief constable, consulting his notes, informed him that the household had begun to experience difficulties approximately 2 years previous, following the death of a distant relation from whom Mrs. Ashford had expected a substantial bequest, and that the reductions in staff had been implemented gradually throughout that period. This intelligence prompted Whimsy to inquire whether anyone in the household had departed under circumstances that might be considered unusual or precipitous, and here the testimony became rather less clear. Mrs. Craddock admitted, under careful questioning, that the previous second housemaid, a girl named Margaret Stokes, had left approximately 3 weeks prior, citing family difficulties and the necessity of returning to her native Yorkshire. Her references had been adequate, her conduct exemplary, and she had provided proper notice, accepting her wages in full and departing without apparent rancour. Yet something in the manner in which Mrs. Craddock imparted this information suggested that the housekeeper possessed knowledge she was reluctant to divulge. And when Whimsy posed the rather specific question of whether Miss Stokes had borne any striking resemblance to Mrs. Ashford in terms of physical appearance, a curious silence descended upon the room. It was the chief constable who eventually ventured the observation that Whimsy's question seemed to suggest a most extraordinary theory, and Whimsy replied, with a smile of considerable opacity, that it suggested nothing of the sort, merely that certain facts were beginning to arrange themselves in a pattern that demanded explanation, and that the pattern in question was rendered considerably more intelligible if one possessed a knowledge of human nature that extended beyond the immediate and obvious. It was at this juncture that Whimsy expressed a desire to examine the correspondence of the deceased with considerably greater attention than had hitherto been devoted to that particular avenue of inquiry, and the chief constable, with evident relief at being offered a task of concrete and measurable nature, dispatched Inspector Catchpole to retrieve the personal papers from Mrs. Ashford's private writing desk. The collection proved to be remarkably voluminous, encompassing letters of various vintages, bills from tradesmen, circulars from charitable organizations, and an extensive correspondence conducted over several years with solicitors concerning the tangled state of her financial affairs. Yet it was the more personal correspondence that captured Whimsy's attention, specifically a series of letters written in a hand that bore remarkable similarities to that upon the unfinished missive discovered beside the corpse, save that these epistles were addressed to an individual identified only as my own darling, and they bore dates spanning the past 18 months. The letters themselves were innocuous enough in their surface content, concerning themselves with the weather, domestic trivialities, and expressions of affection that might have been exchanged between any two individuals possessed of romantic inclinations. Yet their cumulative effect suggested something rather more complex, a relationship of considerable emotional intensity, conducted with the sort of circumspection that implied a necessity for secrecy. More intriguingly, several of these letters bore postmarks indicating they had been directed to an address in Yorkshire, care of a Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, a name that appeared in the household accounts as the recipient of a quarterly allowance of £20, a sum that had been paid with remarkable regularity for a period extending back some 8 years. The revelation of this allowance proved to be the catalyst that transformed the chief constable's expression from one of professional bewilderment to something approaching genuine alarm, and he immediately undertook the task of determining the identity and current whereabouts of Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, with the urgency of a man who sensed that his understanding of the case had been fundamentally altered. It transpired, upon investigation by the local constabulary, that Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood maintained a residence in a small village outside Leeds, a property that had been leased by her for the past decade under circumstances that suggested considerable financial stability, despite the fact that the woman herself appeared to possess no visible means of support beyond the quarterly allowance from Mrs. Ashford. More provocatively still, neighbours in the vicinity of Mrs. Blackwood's residence reported that she maintained a daughter, a young woman of perhaps 25 years of age, of attractive appearance, and notably reserved demeanour, who had resided with her mother for approximately 2 years previous. This daughter, identified as Miss Catherine Blackwood, had departed from the Yorkshire residence some 3 weeks prior, under circumstances that her mother had characterised as a temporary visit to London, an arrangement that appeared to have been conducted with considerable secrecy and some apparent urgency. The local Yorkshire constabulary, when contacted by telephone, professed themselves unable to locate either Miss Catherine Blackwood or her mother, both of whom had apparently vacated the residence within the past fortnight, leaving no forwarding address and settling their final accounts with a rapidity that suggested premeditation rather than the ordinary conduct of domestic affairs. Whimsy received this intelligence with an expression of serene satisfaction, as though he had merely confirmed what logical deduction had already established, and he posed a series of questions that appeared, upon their surface, to be entirely tangential to the matter at hand. He inquired whether the pale brown hair discovered upon the servants' room windowsill might be submitted for examination by a specialist possessing expertise in such matters. He requested a detailed description of Margaret Stokes from Mrs. Craddock, paying particular attention to the woman's height, the colour and texture of her hair, and any distinguishing physical characteristics that might be noted, and he posed the rather specific question of whether Mrs. Ashford had been in the habit of receiving visitors from her relatives, and whether such visits had been characterized by the sort of discretion that suggested they were to be kept from the knowledge of the household staff. Mrs. Craddock, when pressed upon these matters, admitted with considerable reluctance that Mrs. Ashford had indeed received visitors on certain occasions, women whom she had designated as distant cousins or connections, and that these visits had invariably been conducted in the morning room, with the door securely closed, and that the visitors in question had been admitted through the side entrance to avoid the observation of the household staff. More damningly still, she confessed that on one occasion, approximately 4 months previous, she had observed Mrs. Ashford and one such visitor in close conversation, and that the resemblance between the two women had been sufficiently pronounced to suggest a familial connection of considerable proximity. Upon being pressed as to the date of the last such visit, Mrs. Craddock's face underwent a profound transformation, and she admitted, with visible distress, that the final visitor had been received precisely 3 weeks prior, on the very day upon which Margaret Stokes had given notice and departed the household. This convergence of dates proved to be the catalyst that precipitated Whimsy into a state of activity that seemed to suggest he had finally perceived the entire structure of the crime in all its grotesque and terrible clarity. He dispatched Bunter to make discreet inquiries concerning the railway stations in the vicinity of Ashford Manor, specifically to determine whether any single woman had purchased a ticket to London on the date in question, and he requested the chief constable to provide him with access to the unfinished letter discovered beside the corpse, along with samples of Mrs. Ashford's handwriting from her personal correspondence. The comparison of these documents, conducted with meticulous precision, revealed a matter of considerable significance. The hand upon the unfinished letter bore characteristics that suggested it had been written in a state of considerable emotional disturbance, the letters themselves becoming progressively more erratic, and the pressure of the pen increasing with each successive word, as though the writer had been engaged in a conversation of mounting intensity simultaneously with the composition of the text. The letter itself read, in full, "My dearest Edmund, I have made a dreadful error, one that haunts me as surely as your ghost haunts my waking hours. I cannot bear the deception any longer. I must tell you the truth about what occurred that night, about what she has become, about," and at this point the narrative terminated abruptly, as though the writer had been interrupted in the midst of revelation. The implications of this unfinished confession hung in the air of the drawing-room like the aftermath of an explosion, and Whimsy found himself obliged to explain, with considerable patience, the nature of the deception that the letter suggested. The reference to Edmund, Mrs. Ashford's late husband, deceased these 8 years, was not, Whimsy ventured to propose, a rhetorical flourish addressed to a departed spirit, but rather an indication that Mrs. Ashford had been in the process of writing a confession addressed to someone she perceived as her late husband's representative or inheritor, possibly the solicitor who administered the estate, or alternatively, a member of the extended family to whom certain truths required to be divulged. The phrase "what she has become" suggested the existence of a female individual whose transformation or degradation had been sufficiently profound as to warrant such anguished consideration, and Whimsy proposed the rather extraordinary theory that this individual was none other than the daughter, the illegitimate daughter, one presumed, whose existence had been concealed through the mechanism of the quarterly allowance and the carefully orchestrated visits conducted in the strictest secrecy. The chief constable received this theory with the expression of a man contemplating a precipice, and it was with visible reluctance that he inquired whether Whimsy was suggesting that Mrs. Ashford herself had been guilty of some maternal transgression so profound as to warrant the contemplation of confession after a lapse of 8 years. It was indeed precisely that which Whimsy suggested, and he proceeded to construct, with the precision of an architect assembling an intricate blueprint, the structure of events that logic and observation had revealed. Consider, he proposed, a woman of considerable social standing and propriety, a widow of some years, whose husband had died under circumstances that had apparently occasioned no scandal. Yet suppose that prior to her widowhood, during the final years of her marriage, Mrs. Ashford had committed an indiscretion of such magnitude as to produce a child born out of wedlock, a circumstance that, in that era, and in those circles, would have constituted a catastrophe of social and moral dimensions. What would such a woman do with the evidence of her transgression? She could not acknowledge the child openly without destroying her reputation and bringing shame upon her family name. Yet neither could she abandon the creature to the uncertain mercies of an institution or the care of strangers. The solution, Whimsy suggested, would be to arrange for the child's maintenance through discreet financial arrangements, to place the infant in the care of a trustworthy woman who could be depended upon to maintain absolute silence, and to conduct such occasional visits as maternal sentiment might demand under conditions of the most rigorous secrecy. Such an arrangement might persist for years, might indeed persist indefinitely, save for the complication that the illegitimate daughter would inevitably grow into adulthood, and an adult possessed of knowledge of such a secret might develop motivations and desires that a mere child could not entertain. The chief constable ventured the objection that this theory, however ingenious, did not account for the actual murder, and Whimsy acknowledged the validity of this observation with a gracious nod. The murder, he proposed, had been committed not by any person motivated by financial gain or inheritance disputes, but rather by an individual consumed by emotions of such intensity and complexity as to render her vulnerable to impulses of violence. Consider the position of the illegitimate daughter, a young woman who had grown to maturity in obscurity, aware of her own inferiority in the eyes of society, cognizant of the circumstances of her birth, yet also aware that her mother, the very woman responsible for her existence and her shameful condition, had maintained her in reasonable comfort while denying her any acknowledgement, any public recognition of their familial bond. Such a woman might harbor emotions of extraordinary intensity, resentment toward the mother who had borne her in sin and then abandoned her to shadows, a desire for recognition and perhaps for retribution, and possibly, underneath the rage, a desperate longing for the acknowledgement and affection that maternal love might provide. When the daughter, having perhaps contrived some pretext for the visit to Surrey, had confronted her mother with these accumulated grievances, when she had demanded recognition, perhaps demanded entry into society as her mother's acknowledged relation, the confrontation might have escalated beyond the point of rational discourse. In a moment of rage, of desperation, of emotional extremity beyond the capacity of ordinary language to express, the daughter might have seized the letter opener from the writing desk and committed the act that had consigned her mother to silence. Yet this theory, while accounting for the motive and the emotional state of the perpetrator, did not entirely explain the mechanics of the crime, and it was here that whimsy introduced the element that had puzzled the local police with such profound consistency. The wet bonnet, he explained, was not evidence of Mrs. Ashford's recent excursion, but rather evidence of the killer's elaborate attempt to create a false identity for herself within the household. By establishing herself as a servant, Margaret Stokes, the daughter had gained access to the manor while remaining invisible to the eyes of those who might recognize her actual identity. She had endured 3 weeks of menial labor, had submitted herself to the authority of Mrs. Craddock and the other servants, all in order to position herself for a moment of confrontation with the mother who had created her and then discarded her into obscurity. The bonnet itself, wet from genuine rain encountered perhaps during her departure from the servants' room, had been left behind in her haste to escape, a final piece of evidence that had inadvertently exposed the carefully constructed deception. And the unfinished letter suggested that Mrs. Ashford, in the moments before her daughter's arrival, had finally resolved to confess, to acknowledge publicly, the truth that had festered in her conscience for 8 years, a resolution that had arrived, with the exquisite tragic timing of circumstance, merely minutes too late to prevent catastrophe. The silence that followed Whimsy's exposition was of that peculiar quality that suggests minds engaged in the process of fundamental reorganization, the chief constable's expression undergoing a succession of transformations that suggested he was simultaneously apprehending the brilliance of the deduction and recoiling from its implications. Inspector Catchpole appeared to be engaged in the laborious process of following the logical chain, his features arranged in a concentration so intense as to suggest physical exertion, while the constables who had been stationed about the room shifted their weight with the discomfort of men, observing the exposure of truths that exceeded their capacity for comprehension. It was Bunter who broke the silence, returning from his inquiries with the intelligence that a young woman answering the description provided had indeed purchased a railway ticket from the station nearest Ashford Manor on the date in question, travelling to London under the assumed name of Miss Margaret Stokes, and that the ticket clerk recalled her with particular vividness because she had purchased her ticket with considerable haste and had inquired anxiously concerning the departure time, as though she anticipated pursuit. More significantly still, the ticket clerk recollected that the young woman in question had been attired in a black serge dress of serviceable cut, the sort of garment worn by domestic servants, yet her hands and deportment had suggested education and refinement considerably beyond what one would expect from such employment. The chief constable immediately dispatched telegrams to Scotland Yard and to the railway stations serving London, requesting that inquiries be made for any young woman of the description provided, and he authorized the circulation of a description to the various metropolitan police divisions with instructions that the individual in question was to be considered extremely dangerous and was wanted for questioning in connection with the murder at Ashford Manor. Yet Whimsy, upon receiving this intelligence, expressed a sentiment that suggested the search might prove considerably more complicated than the chief constable's optimism implied. The young woman in question, he observed, possessed the advantage of familiarity with London, or at least the capacity to acquire such familiarity through the employment of her undoubtedly superior intelligence and education. She would be cognizant of the danger represented by police inquiries. She would understand that her appearance in the household accounts as Margaret Stokes would inevitably lead to her identification, and she would possess the resourcefulness born of desperation and the clarity of mind that sometimes accompanies individuals who have committed acts of extreme violence. Moreover, Whimsy suggested with a delicacy that did not entirely mask the gravity of his concern, the young woman might harbor intentions that transcended mere evasion of justice. The psychological state that had culminated in matricide might not conclude with simple flight. It might instead exhibit itself in further acts of violence or self-destruction, motivated by remorse, by a desire to eliminate evidence, or by a determination to avenge herself upon those whom she perceived as responsible for her sufferings. It was at this juncture that Whimsy proposed a course of action that the chief constable initially received with considerable skepticism. Rather than conducting the search through the ordinary mechanisms of police inquiry, which would inevitably alert the perpetrator to the intensity of the investigation, Whimsy suggested that inquiry be made into the identity of those individuals and institutions toward whom the quarterly allowance had been directed, and that particular attention be paid to the solicitor or banker through whom these payments had been processed. Such an individual would possess comprehensive knowledge of Mrs. Ashford's affairs, would be cognizant of the existence of the daughter, and might well have received communications from the young woman following the murder, particularly if the daughter possessed any intention of claiming a share of her mother's estate, or of establishing her legitimacy through legal proceedings. The chief constable, appreciating the logic of this proposal, immediately set about the task of determining the identity of the solicitor in question, and it transpired upon investigation that Mrs. Ashford's legal affairs had been conducted for the past 15 years by a Mr. Edmund Hargrove, a gentleman of considerable standing in the county, and a solicitor of reputable character whose offices were situated in the market town of Guildford, a distance of some 10 miles from Ashford Manor. A discreet inquiry conducted by Whimsy himself, for he deemed it prudent to handle this particular matter with personal attention, revealed that Mr. Hargrove had indeed received a letter bearing a London postmark, dated 3 days subsequent to the murder, in which an unsigned correspondent had inquired concerning the possibility of challenging Mrs. Ashford's will on the grounds of a concealed legitimacy claim, and had requested information concerning the procedures by which such a claim might be established. This letter, when examined by Whimsy with the assistance of Mr. Hargrove's somewhat reluctant cooperation, proved to be written in the same hand as the correspondence discovered in Mrs. Ashford's personal papers, though the emotional disturbance evident in the unfinished deathbed letter had given way to a coldly rational and even menacing tone. The writer expressed her determination to establish her rightful claim to her mother's estate. She detailed her knowledge of the quarterly allowance and the circumstances of her concealment, and she intimated, with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation, that unless her claim was recognized and accommodated through the settlement of a substantial sum, she would ensure that the truth concerning Mrs. Ashford's secret child became public knowledge, thereby destroying the reputation of the Ashford family and ensuring that the scandal would pursue the memory of the deceased beyond the grave. It was, in essence, a demand for blackmail to be paid in the form of inheritance, a circumstance that suggested the daughter's emotional state had transformed itself from passionate desperation into something considerably more dangerous and calculating. The letter concluded with the instruction that Mr. Hargrove was to place an advertisement in the classified section of the Times, indicating his willingness to negotiate, and that further communication would be conducted through an intermediary, to be determined subsequently. The discovery of the blackmail letter transformed the entire character of the investigation from a matter of criminal detection to something considerably more urgent and complex. for it suggested that the perpetrator remained active, motivated by greed as much as by rage, and possessed of sufficient intelligence to conduct her affairs with calculation and foresight. Whimsy's response to this intelligence was characteristically oblique. He expressed a desire to examine the Times classified advertisements for the period subsequent to the letter's posting, and he inquired with meticulous precision concerning the identity of the intermediary through whom further communication was to be conducted. Mr. Hargrove, somewhat reluctant to divulge information that he regarded as privileged communication with a potential client, eventually disclosed that he had received a second letter, this one bearing a different postmark and written in a masculine hand, which identified itself as coming from a gentleman who represented the interests of a client wishing to remain anonymous, and which proposed a meeting to be conducted at a location to be specified subsequently. The letter had been received 3 days prior, and it bore all the characteristics of professional legal correspondence, composed with sufficient formality and precision as to suggest that the individual in question possessed considerable familiarity with the mechanisms of negotiation and contract. More intriguingly still, the letter contained a specific reference to a particular provision in Mrs. Ashford's will, a bequest of £5,000 to the British Museum, which suggested that the writer possessed detailed knowledge of the deceased's estate and its distribution. This revelation prompted Whimsy to pose a question of such specificity as to suggest he had perceived the entire mechanism of the young woman's strategy with crystalline clarity. Had Mr. Hargrove, Whimsy inquired, received any other communications from the solicitor or legal representatives of any individual who might possess claim to Mrs. Ashford's estate? The question hung in the air for a moment before Mr. Hargrove's expression underwent a profound transformation, and he confessed with evident embarrassment that he had indeed received preliminary inquiries from a London solicitor concerning the possibility of establishing a claim to the Ashford estate on behalf of a client whose identity had been withheld pending preliminary negotiations. The London solicitor in question was a gentleman named Prescott, with offices in Lincoln's Inn Fields, and his inquiries had been sufficiently vague as to suggest either discretion or ignorance concerning the true nature of the claim being advanced. Whimsy requested the correspondence in question with an urgency that suggested to the chief constable that matters were reaching a critical juncture, and upon examination of Mr. Prescott's letters, a most curious pattern emerged. The correspondence was impeccably professional in tone and substance, yet it contained certain peculiarities of phrasing that suggested the writer was not entirely comfortable with the legal conventions he was employing, and there were occasional lapses in grammar and construction that indicated English was not his native language, or alternatively, that the letters were being composed by someone engaged in deliberate mimicry of professional correspondence. The most revealing aspect of the letters, however, was an apparent contradiction that Whimsy identified with his characteristic precision. Mr. Prescott had inquired concerning the procedures for establishing a legitimacy claim, yet he had simultaneously requested information concerning the procedures for challenging the validity of a will on other grounds entirely. Suggestions of undue influence, of mental incapacity, of fraudulent execution. This combination of inquiries was sufficiently unusual as to suggest that the person directing Mr. Prescott's correspondence was uncertain as to which avenue of legal assault would prove most efficacious, and was therefore pursuing multiple strategies simultaneously. More revealing still was the fact that Mr. Prescott's letters contained references to specific details concerning Mrs. Ashford's personal life, her relationship with her late husband, her habits and routines, her financial circumstances, that would have been available only to someone with intimate knowledge of the household or access to private correspondence. This suggested with uncomfortable clarity that the young woman who had murdered her mother was not operating independently, but rather in concert with an accomplice who possessed the capacity to conduct negotiations through legal intermediaries, and who possessed sufficient knowledge of the law to formulate claims of considerable sophistication. Whimsy's response to this discovery was to request, with what appeared to be irrelevant courtesy, the telephone directory for London, and to examine with meticulous attention the list of solicitors practicing in Lincoln's Inn Fields. Upon conducting a discreet inquiry through channels that he declined to specify, it transpired that Mr. Prescott's office had been established only recently, within the past 6 months, and that the individual identified as Mr. Prescott was in fact a woman, a solicitor of considerable accomplishment, who had formerly practiced in Yorkshire under a different name and who had relocated to London under circumstances that had occasioned some professional comment and no small degree of scandal. The woman in question was identified as Miss Catherine Blackwood, which was to say, Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood's daughter, which is to say, the very individual whom Whimsy had been pursuing with such logical precision. She had, it appeared, qualified as a solicitor some 8 years previously through a combination of legal study and exceptional intelligence, had practiced in Yorkshire under her mother's surname, and had relocated to London precisely 3 weeks prior, on the very date upon which her sister had departed from the household at Ashford Manor, following the commission of the murder. This convergence of dates, this revelation of a second individual operating in concert with the perpetrator, suggested that the crime was not the impulsive act of emotional extremity that initial appearances had suggested, but rather a carefully orchestrated scheme conducted by two sisters united by circumstance, by resentment, and by a determination to extract whatever recompense they could from the woman who had created them both, and then abandoned them to obscurity and shame. The implications of this revelation produced in the Chief Constable a state of profound agitation that manifested itself in an urgent desire to place both Miss Catherine Blackwood and her sister under immediate arrest, a sentiment that Whimsy received with a calm that bordered upon the philosophical. The arrest of Miss Blackwood, he ventured to suggest, would prove considerably more complicated than the Chief Constable's enthusiasm implied, for the young woman possessed both the intelligence and the legal knowledge to conduct a defense of remarkable sophistication. And more critically still, her arrest would inevitably alert her sister to the fact that the investigation had progressed beyond mere suspicion into the realm of concrete evidence and imminent apprehension. The strategy that Whimsy proposed was therefore one of elaborate patience and psychological manipulation, conducted with the precision of a chess player executing a gambit, whose full consequences would not become apparent until several moves had transpired. Rather than move openly against Miss Catherine Blackwood, Whimsy suggested that she be permitted to continue her negotiations with Mr. Hargrove, that Mr. Hargrove be instructed to indicate his willingness to negotiate on behalf of the Ashford estate, and that a meeting be arranged at a location of Whimsy's selection, where the full machinery of observation and evidence gathering could be brought to bear upon the conduct of the negotiation itself. The Chief Constable, reluctant though he was to tolerate further delay, acknowledged the logic of this proposal, and arrangements were accordingly made. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon at the offices of a solicitor in Chancery Lane, a gentleman of discretion and considerable courage, who had agreed to participate in what amounted to an elaborate trap, conducted under the direction of Whimsy, with the assistance of Scotland Yard detectives stationed discreetly in adjacent chambers. Whimsy himself attended the meeting in the guise of a gentleman of business, introduced as the estate's representative, a deception that appeared to occasion no suspicion on the part of Miss Catherine Blackwood, who arrived precisely at the appointed hour, attired in the severe and professional costume of a woman solicitor, her demeanor conveying the chilly politeness of someone engaged in negotiation across a considerable gulf of professional distance. She was a woman of perhaps 28 years of age, of striking rather than conventionally attractive appearance, with dark hair and sharp, intelligent features that bore a marked resemblance to those of the deceased Mrs. Ashford, a similarity that would have been immediately apparent to anyone cognizant of the familial relationship. She conducted herself with remarkable composure throughout the preliminary exchanges, discussing the potential claims with a detachment that suggested she was merely advancing a legal argument rather than pursuing a personal vendetta against the memory of her mother. Yet certain small signs, a tightening of the jaw at particular moments, a slight tremor in her voice when reference was made to Mrs. Ashford's conduct, suggested emotions of considerable intensity barely suppressed beneath the veneer of professional courtesy. The negotiation proceeded according to a script that Whimsy had devised with meticulous attention to psychological principle. And at each stage he introduced observations and inquiries that appeared merely to address the legal and financial aspects of the claim, yet which were in fact designed to elicit responses that would establish, with irrefutable clarity, the degree of knowledge possessed by Miss Blackwood concerning the circumstances of her mother's death and the conduct of her sister. When reference was made, in what appeared to be casual fashion, to the peculiar nature of the injuries inflicted upon the deceased, Miss Blackwood's response was to observe, with a precision that could scarcely have been achieved through mere speculation, that the weapon employed would have required considerable force to penetrate the thorax at the particular angle indicated by the coroner's report, and that such force would necessarily have been accompanied by considerable emotional disturbance on the part of the perpetrator. The observation was sufficiently specific as to suggest that Miss Blackwood possessed knowledge that extended beyond what would have been available through examination of the preliminary police reports, and when Whimsy pressed the point with gentle persistence, Miss Blackwood appeared to realize she had overextended herself, and her composure underwent a subtle but unmistakable alteration. It was at this critical moment that Whimsy introduced the matter of the wet bonnet, describing it with a precision that suggested he perceived it not merely as a piece of evidence, but as a symbol of the entire emotional trajectory of the crime, a bonnet left behind in haste by a woman consumed by conflicting emotions of rage and desperation, of the desire for acknowledgement, and the recognition of profound injustice. Miss Blackwood's response to this observation was to abandon entirely the pretense of professional detachment and to launch into a passionate denunciation of Mrs. Ashford that revealed, with terrible clarity, the psychological foundations upon which the entire scheme had been constructed. She spoke of the degradation of being hidden away, of the shame of illegitimacy, of the casual cruelty with which Mrs. Ashford had distributed her quarterly allowance as though it represented charity, rather than the barest acknowledgement of maternal obligation. She described the letters that her mother had written to her father, letters that had been preserved by Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, and had been shown to her daughters as evidence of their mother's ongoing preoccupation with her distant children. Letters that had been composed in terms of such passionate affection, yet accompanied by such absolute refusal to acknowledge them publicly, that they had constituted a form of emotional torture of extraordinary refinement, and she confessed, with a bitterness that seemed to consume her entirely, that she and her sister had conspired together to extract from Mrs. Ashford's estate whatever recompense the law might permit, not from desire for financial gain, but from a determination to force public acknowledgement of what had been hidden in shame for so many years. It was at this juncture that the doors to the solicitor's chambers opened to admit Inspector Catchpole and 2 constables, and the entire machinery of legal arrest was set in motion with a precision that suggested the preceding negotiation had been conducted entirely for the purpose of extracting a confession that would render the gathering of additional evidence superfluous. Miss Catherine Blackwood received the announcement of her arrest with a composure that suggested she had anticipated this denouement from the moment Whimsy had introduced the matter of the bonnet, and she submitted to the process of being taken into custody without resistance, though her expression suggested emotions of such complexity as to defy simple categorization. Yet it was not until several hours had elapsed, when the machinery of formal interrogation had been set in motion, and Miss Blackwood had been permitted a brief interview with a solicitor of her own selection, that the full truth concerning the murder of Mrs. Ashford began to emerge in all its terrible and intricate detail. For Miss Blackwood's confession, when it came, revealed that she had not herself wielded the letter opener, but rather had been instrumental in the psychological manipulation that had rendered her sister vulnerable to impulses of violence, and had subsequently orchestrated the elaborate scheme of blackmail and legal claims designed to extract whatever satisfaction could be achieved from the ruins of her mother's reputation and estate. The narrative that emerged from this confession painted a picture of premeditation far more calculated and deliberate than the initial investigation had suggested. The two sisters, it transpired, had been in communication for the past 2 years through carefully concealed correspondence, and they had developed in concert a plan that was designed to accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously: to confront their mother with the reality of her transgression, to extract financial recompense from her estate, and to ensure that the truth concerning her illegitimate children would become public knowledge, thereby destroying the reputation that she had guarded so zealously throughout her life. The decision to place the younger sister, Margaret, in the household as a servant had been deliberate and calculated, designed to provide her with the opportunity to observe the household routines, to determine the precise emotional state of Mrs. Ashford, and to position herself for a confrontation that Catherine had orchestrated through a series of carefully composed letters designed to prey upon her mother's conscience and to provoke her into a state of emotional vulnerability. The unfinished letter discovered beside the corpse had been precipitated by one such communication from Catherine, in which she had threatened to expose the entire truth unless Mrs. Ashford agreed to publicly acknowledge her illegitimate children and to provide them with proper financial provision. Mrs. Ashford, confronted with the prospect of public humiliation and the destruction of her carefully constructed social position, had begun to write her confession, a process that had been interrupted by Margaret's arrival at the morning room door. What had transpired in the moments that followed had been, according to Miss Blackwood's account, a confrontation that had exceeded in emotional intensity anything that either sister had anticipated. Margaret had come to her mother not with measured demands, but with the accumulated anguish of a lifetime of concealment and shame, and the conversation had quickly escalated beyond the point of rational discourse into territory characterized by accusations and recriminations of devastating specificity. Mrs. Ashford, confronted with a daughter she scarcely recognized, confronted with the emotional consequences of her own choices crystallized in the form of a young woman consumed by justified rage, had initially attempted to maintain her customary composure, but this facade had crumbled rapidly in the face of Margaret's passionate denunciations. The younger woman had demanded not merely money but acknowledgement, demanded that her mother agree to introduce her into society as a daughter rather than a distant cousin, demanded that the truth be revealed to the extended family and to the world at large. When Mrs. Ashford had attempted to refuse, when she had suggested that such a course would be impossible given the scandal it would occasion, Margaret's emotional state had apparently undergone a catastrophic transformation. In a moment of rage that appeared to have surprised even Margaret herself, she had seized the letter opener from the desk and had driven it between her mother's ribs with a force born of desperation and accumulated resentment too profound for words to contain. The circumstances of the crime, as reconstructed through Margaret's subsequent confession to her sister and through Catherine's detailed interrogation, suggested that the murder had not been premeditated in its final execution, though the circumstances that had culminated in that execution had been deliberately engineered through the orchestrations of both sisters working in concert. Margaret had fled the house immediately following the act, had made her way to the servants' room where she had changed her clothing, and had departed through the side entrance with sufficient speed to avoid observation. The wet bonnet, which had been discovered upon the ottoman, had been left behind in the confusion of her departure, a small oversight that had ultimately proved more revealing than the perpetrator could have anticipated. Catherine, upon learning of the murder through the careful means of communication the sisters had established, had not abandoned her sister to the machinery of justice, but rather had immediately begun to construct the elaborate scheme of legal blackmail and negotiation designed to extract whatever financial and social advantage could be achieved from the tragedy that had resulted from their conspiracy of psychological manipulation. The confession of Miss Catherine Blackwood, when taken in conjunction with Margaret's own statement, which had been obtained through separate interrogation conducted with the assistance of a female detective of considerable skill and sensitivity, revealed the crime in all its moral and psychological complexity. It was not a matter of simple murder, nor of premeditated assassination, but rather of a deliberately contrived situation that had been designed to expose and to exploit the psychological vulnerabilities of an individual who, whatever her failings as a mother, had been driven by the genuine misguided belief that she was acting in the best interests of her illegitimate children by concealing their existence and maintaining them in obscurity. The tragedy that had resulted from this maternal deception, when filtered through the lens of two daughters consumed by justified resentment and by the sophisticated psychological understanding of one trained in the law, had culminated in an act of violence whose ultimate responsibility extended far beyond the single moment in which the letter opener had been drawn and wielded. The trials that followed were conducted with that peculiar mixture of legal formality and public spectacle that characterized the English judicial system when matters of considerable social consequence were brought before the courts, and they generated a degree of public interest and moral controversy that extended far beyond the ordinary parameters of criminal procedure. Margaret Blackwood, charged with the murder of her mother, conducted herself throughout the proceedings with a demeanor that suggested she had achieved a state of emotional exhaustion so profound as to render her incapable of further feeling, and her defense counsel, a gentleman of considerable ability who had been engaged at considerable expense through the machinations of certain sympathetic relatives, advanced arguments that appealed less to the letter of the law than to the conscience and sympathies of the jury. The case presented to the court was one of extraordinary psychological complexity. A young woman, denied acknowledgement, denied the basic human dignity of legitimate birth, had been deliberately manipulated into a state of emotional extremity by a sister possessed of sufficient intelligence and legal knowledge to understand precisely which psychological levers, when activated, would produce the desired result. The prosecution, meanwhile, advanced the argument that the circumstances of Margaret's birth, however tragic, could not serve as justification for the deliberate taking of human life, and that to permit such arguments would be to introduce into the law a subjective element of sympathy and social justice that would ultimately undermine the foundations of legal order itself. The trial of Catherine Blackwood presented even more subtle and complex questions, for she stood accused not of murder, but of conspiracy to commit murder, of psychological manipulation conducted with the deliberate intent of precipitating a violent act, and of subsequent blackmail and extortion, directed toward the extraction of financial gain from the death she had orchestrated. The arguments advanced in her defense suggested that she had not anticipated the precise form that violence would take, that she had sought only to expose the truth and to force her mother into acknowledgement of her illegitimate children, and that the tragic consequences that had resulted from her actions, while deeply regrettable, could not be said to constitute the necessary and foreseeable outcome of her conduct. The prosecution countered with the observation that a woman trained in law, a woman possessed of considerable intelligence and psychological acuity, could scarcely be permitted to claim ignorance of the likely consequences of deliberately provoking emotional confrontation between a mother and a daughter driven to desperation by years of concealment and shame. The arguments consumed the better part of 3 weeks, and the courtroom became a stage upon which the entire moral and psychological architecture of the crime was subjected to exhaustive examination. It was during the course of Margaret's trial that Lord Peter Wimsey was called upon to give testimony concerning his investigation and his conclusions regarding the psychological state of the perpetrator and the circumstances that had culminated in the act of violence. His testimony was delivered with characteristic precision and an ironic detachment that suggested he regarded the proceedings with a certain philosophical distance, yet beneath the surface courtesy and the occasional displays of pedantic wit lay a profound understanding of the human condition that transcended the immediate legal questions at issue. Whimsy's evidence concerning the wet bonnet, concerning the timeline of events, concerning the peculiar psychological profile of a young woman caught between the desires for revenge and for maternal acknowledgement, was presented with such clarity and such devastating logical precision as to render further argument on certain fundamental points virtually impossible. Yet it was Whimsy's final remarks, offered in response to a question from the defense counsel concerning his assessment of moral culpability, that captured the essential tragedy of the case with a precision that appeared to affect even the hardened members of the legal profession. He observed that the crime represented not merely the act of an individual consumed by justified rage, but rather the inevitable consequence of a social order that had placed impossible constraints upon the expression of human truth, and that had driven individuals to conceal the evidence of their own humanity rather than permit public acknowledgement of transgression and error. The verdicts, when they came, reflected the profound moral ambiguity that the case had generated throughout its course. Margaret Blackwood was found guilty of murder, but with a strong recommendation to mercy from the jury, a circumstance that resulted in her sentence being commuted from capital punishment to penal servitude for life, a sentence that would eventually be further reduced through the mechanisms of official clemency. Catherine Blackwood was found guilty of conspiracy and blackmail, but the jury's findings suggested considerable sympathy for her motivations, and her sentence, while substantial, was considerably more lenient than the maximum permitted by law. The verdicts satisfied no one entirely. The legal establishment regarded them as dangerously lenient, a capitulation to sentiment over the requirements of justice. The families of the Ashford name regarded them as insufficient acknowledgement of the catastrophe that had been visited upon their reputation, and the sympathetic members of the public who had followed the trial with intense interest regarded them as inadequate recognition of the profound injustices that had precipitated the crime in the first instance. It was in the aftermath of these proceedings, when the machinery of justice had ground to its conclusion and the newspapers had exhausted their interest in the case, that Whimsy found himself in conversation with the chief constable, who had sought him out to express his profound gratitude for the manner in which the investigation had been conducted and brought to its resolution. The chief constable ventured the observation that Whimsy must feel considerable satisfaction at having unravelled so complex a mystery with such precision and elegance of method, and Whimsy received this sentiment with an expression of profound weariness that suggested the satisfaction in question was considerably tempered by a recognition of the human costs that the investigation had exacted. He observed, with a gravity that seemed to contradict his habitual manner, that the resolution of a mystery did not necessarily constitute the achievement of justice, and that the most troubling aspect of the entire affair was not the question of who had committed the murder, but rather the broader question of what social circumstances, what patterns of deception and concealment, what failures of moral courage and human compassion had rendered such a tragedy inevitable from the moment of the illegitimate children's conception. The autumn had turned to winter by the time Whimsy departed from Surrey, the landscape having undergone that transformation whereby the countryside assumes the appearance of having been drained of all vitality and colour, and the manor itself seemed to have settled into a state of permanent melancholy that suggested its very stones had absorbed the tragedy that had transpired within its confines. The chief constable had pressed upon him various expressions of official gratitude, and the local press had conducted interviews designed to celebrate the brilliance of the investigation. Yet Whimsy received all of this with a courtesy that masked a profound disinclination to dwell upon the matter any further. He returned to his flat in Piccadilly on a grey afternoon, when the London fog hung low over the city like a pall, and he found waiting for him a letter bearing the postmark of the prison in which Catherine Blackwood was serving her sentence. The letter was written in a careful, precise hand, and it expressed gratitude for the manner in which Whimsy had conducted the investigation, not with the obsequiousness of one seeking favour, but with the dignity of an individual acknowledging a debt that extended beyond the purely legal dimensions of the case. She wrote of her sister, who was reportedly adjusting to her imprisonment with a courage that had surprised even the prison authorities, she wrote of her mother, whose memory was beginning to assume, in the reconstruction of events conducted through the lens of legal proceedings and public commentary, a more sympathetic aspect than had characterized her during her living years. And she wrote of her own understanding that whatever justice the courts might dispense, it could not alter the fundamental truth that two daughters had been born of deceit and concealed in shame, and that no amount of legal remedy could restore to them the years and the human dignity that had been denied them through no fault of their own. Whimsy found himself moved by the letter in a manner that his habitual irony and detachment did not ordinarily permit, and he spent an evening engaged in the composition of a response that attempted to address, with such grace and honesty as his considerable literary skill permitted, the profound questions that the case had raised concerning justice, morality, and the capacity of the legal system to address the underlying causes of human tragedy. He wrote of his observation that society frequently demanded of women a degree of moral perfection that it declined to require of men. He wrote of his conviction that Mrs. Ashford's error, while undeniably tragic in its consequences, had been motivated by the genuine if misguided belief that concealment represented the most merciful course available to her. And he wrote of his sense that the true tragedy of the case lay not in the murder itself, but in the societal structures that had rendered such tragedy inevitable from the moment the illegitimate children had been conceived. The letter, which he did not ultimately send, was discovered among his papers after his death, and it revealed, to those sufficiently perceptive to perceive it, a depth of moral seriousness that underlay the surface of his characteristic wit and ironic detachment. In the months that followed, Whimsy found himself reflecting with increasing frequency upon the case, and upon the manner in which the investigation had proceeded from the discovery of a wet bonnet to the exposure of a conspiracy of psychological manipulation that had spanned years and culminated in an act of violence that no single individual could be said to bear sole responsibility for committing. He attended with some reluctance a lecture conducted by a distinguished criminologist concerning the psychological foundations of criminal behavior, and he found himself moved to challenge certain assertions made by the speaker concerning the relative culpability of individuals whose crimes appeared to be motivated by passion, as opposed to those whose crimes appeared to be motivated by rational calculation. His contribution to the discussion, which was recorded in the published proceedings of the lecture series, revealed a complexity of thinking that suggested he regarded the distinction between passion and calculation as considerably more ambiguous than the speaker had implied, and that he believed the law would do well to consider more carefully the psychological and social circumstances that rendered certain individuals vulnerable to the commission of acts that more privileged or more emotionally stable individuals might successfully resist. It was Bunter who eventually brought the matter to what might be considered a provisional conclusion, on an evening when Whimsy was engaged in the perusal of a particularly demanding volume of classical philosophy. Bunter informed his employer that he had been contacted by a representative of the Home Office concerning the possibility of a petition for clemency on behalf of Margaret Blackwood, and that certain influential individuals, moved by the circumstances of the case and by the evident remorse displayed by the perpetrator, were considering the advancement of such a petition. Whimsy received this intelligence with an expression that suggested he was simultaneously gratified by the possibility of clemency and troubled by the implications that such clemency might carry concerning the nature of justice and the principle that laws applied equally to all persons, regardless of their circumstances. He instructed Bunter to discover the names of those individuals who were prepared to advance such a petition, and he subsequently wrote to several of them, expressing his conviction that, while the law could not be suspended or fundamentally altered to accommodate the peculiar circumstances of any individual case, there remained considerable room for the exercise of mercy and clemency in the aftermath of legal conviction, particularly when the perpetrator had displayed genuine remorse and when the underlying social circumstances that had contributed to the crime suggested that a more humane approach to punishment might serve the interests of justice more effectively than the rigid application of statutory penalties. Whether Whimsy's intervention influenced the eventual decision of the Home Office to grant a partial commutation of Margaret Blackwood's sentence could not be determined with certainty. But the young woman was eventually released after serving a portion of her sentence that, while substantial, fell considerably short of the life imprisonment to which she had been initially condemned. The epilogue to the case, insofar as such matters may be said to have epilogues, suggested that Margaret had attempted to construct a life of modest respectability in a small village in Cornwall, where her identity and her history were unknown to her neighbours, and where she engaged in charitable work and the cultivation of a modest garden with a dedication that suggested she had achieved some measure of peace with the terrible act that had defined her existence. Catherine, meanwhile, had been released upon the completion of her sentence, and she had apparently undertaken the study of philosophical and theological questions concerning the nature of justice and moral culpability, a pursuit that suggested her considerable intellectual powers were being directed toward the understanding rather than the exploitation of human suffering. Whimsy never learned the precise details of what became of either sister in the years following their release from prison, but he occasionally reflected, in moments of philosophical contemplation, upon the manner in which the machinery of justice, while effective at establishing facts and determining legal culpability, remained profoundly limited in its capacity to address the underlying human questions that had precipitated the crime, or to restore to individuals the fundamental dignity and acknowledgement that had been denied them through no fault of their own.